Point at something across a room, and a dog will look where you are pointing. That sounds like nothing at all. It is not nothing. Do the same thing to a chimpanzee, and it will look at your hand. A chimpanzee shares far more of your DNA than a dog does, and beats a dog at almost every other kind of puzzle. Not this one. Wolves raised in human homes from birth mostly fail it as well. Puppies pass it at 9 weeks old, with almost no training and almost no experience of people. Somewhere in the last few tens of thousands of years, a large predator was rebuilt into an animal that watches our faces for instructions. This is the story of how that happened. It is also a story about how genuinely bad the evidence is. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about the first dog. We cannot agree on which bones it is. Start with that problem because the whole field lives inside it. A dog is a wolf. Not descended from a wolf in the loose way you are descended from an ape. A dog is a subspecies of gray wolf. Dogs and wolves still interbreed and produce fertile young. Biologically, they are the same animal wearing different shapes. Which leaves the archaeologist holding a jawbone and an almost impossible question. Is this a small wolf or an early dog? The traditional answers are all about the skull. Dogs tend to have a shorter, wider snout, a crowded tooth row because the teeth stayed the same size while the jaw got shorter, a steeper step between the muzzle and the forehead. That would be fine, except every one of those features also varies inside wild wolf populations. And every one of them shifts with the animal's age, its sex, and what it spent its life chewing. So you get arguments like the one about the Goyet skull. In 2009, a team led by Mich Germonpro published a canid skull from Goyet Cave in Belgium, dated to around 36,000 years ago, and identified it as a dog. A dog in the Ice Age, 20,000 years earlier than anyone expected. Enormous if it holds. Other researchers measured the same skull and said, that is a wolf. Or possibly a wolf from a population that does not exist anymore, which is not the same thing as a dog. The same argument has been had about a skull from Predmosty in the Czech Republic and about one from the Altai Mountains in Siberia. Every early candidate has been contested. None of them has been settled. And underneath the measuring problem sits a worse one. Ancient DNA has now shown that most of the wolf lineages that were alive during the Ice Age are simply gone. So when you compare an ancient skull against a modern wolf, you may be comparing it against entirely the wrong wolf. Which is why the earliest dog that almost everybody accepts is not the oldest candidate. And it was not identified by the shape of its bones at all. In 1914, quarry workers near Bonn, in Germany, blasted into a grave. Inside were two people, a man of about 40 and a woman of about 25, buried together with red ochre and with worked bone and antler. There were animal bones in there too. For most of a century, nobody paid them much attention. When they were finally examined properly, they turned out to be a dog, then to be two dogs, then to be a story. The grave is a little over 14,000 years old. The main animal was a puppy, about 7 months old when it died. And its teeth carry the damage that canine distemper leaves behind, lines and pits in the enamel laid down while the tooth was still growing. Distemper does not arrive once. It comes in waves. The virus attacks, the animal seems to get better, it comes back, and the third phase is neurological. Luke Janssens and his colleagues, working through the teeth in 2018, concluded that this puppy had been through at least 2 of those waves, and probably 3. Which means it was seriously ill for something like 5 to 8 weeks. Now think about what a puppy in that state actually is. It cannot hunt. It cannot keep up with the group on the move. It cannot keep itself warm. It has diarrhea and a fever, and by the 3rd wave it is having seizures. It survives only if somebody carries it, keeps giving it water, keeps it warm, and cleans up after it. For weeks. In the Ice Age. It offers nothing in return. It is not going to become a useful animal. It is quite likely to die anyway. It did die anyway. And then somebody put it in a grave with 2 human beings. That is the evidence, not the shape of the skull, the behavior around it. Nobody nurses a wild animal through 2 months of a disease that pays nothing back, and then buries it in their own grave, unless the relationship had already turned into something else. Whether the Goyet skull is a dog is an argument about millimeters. Bonn-Oberkassel is an argument you cannot really have. So when did all this start? Genetics ought to settle it, and for 20 years it has done nothing of the kind. Estimates for the split between dogs and living wolves have ranged from about 40,000 years ago down to about 15,000. As for where serious papers have argued for East Asia, for Central Asia, for the Middle East, for Europe, and for Siberia. In 2016, a team including Laurent France and Gregor Larson proposed something that would explain the mess. That it happened twice, independently, at each end of Eurasia, and that the eastern dogs later swept west and largely replaced the western ones. That is not settled either. What ancient DNA has firmly established is this. By 11,000 years ago, dogs were already a distinct thing, already varied by region, and already traveling with people across enormous distances. In 2020, Anders Bergstrom and colleagues sequenced dog genomes going back 11,000 years and found at least 5 deeply separate lineages already in place. 5. 11,000 years ago, before farming had spread anywhere much. Which pushes the actual beginning back a long way before that, into the Ice Age, among hunter-gatherers. And the genetics says one more thing, which is oddly unsettling. No living population of wolves is the ancestor of dogs. Not one of them. Dogs and all modern gray wolves are sister branches off a common trunk. The wolves that became dogs are extinct. So the animal that first stopped running away from human campfire is not any wolf you have ever seen a photograph of. Which leaves the hardest question of all. How does a large, dangerous, territorial predator turn into a dog? The story most of us carry around is that somebody stole a litter of wolf cubs and raised them by hand. People certainly did that. People hand-rear all sorts of wild animals. The trouble is that hand-reared wolves do not become dogs. They become hand-reared wolves. They are affectionate, and they are trainable, and at sexual maturity, a great many of them become impossible to keep. And none of it is heritable. Do it again with the next generation, and you start again from nothing. So the more likely story runs the other way round, and Raymond and Lorna Coppinger made the argument most clearly. Human camps produce waste. Bones, offal, gut contents, scraps, feces. A heap of that is a food supply that never runs, never fights back, and costs nothing to catch. And hunting, by comparison, is expensive and fails most of the time. But to use a rubbish heap, an animal has to be able to tolerate being close to people. The distance at which an animal panics and bolts is a real trait. It varies between individuals, and it is inherited. So the selection pressure was not applied by us. It was applied by the rubbish heap. The wolves that could sit 20 meters away instead of 208 better survived better, and had more pups who could also sit 20 meters away. Nobody chose anything. The animals that could stand us simply outcompeted the ones that could not. And the strange part is what else came along for the ride. In 1959, in Novosibirsk, a Soviet geneticist called Dmitry Belyaev started an experiment on silver foxes. He selected for exactly one thing. Not size, not color, not cleverness. Tameness. He would approach a cub and breed from the ones that fled least. Within a surprisingly small number of generations, the foxes were actively seeking out human company. And they had also started to grow floppy ears, curly tails, patches of white in the coat, shorter snouts, and they kept playing like cubs long into adulthood. Nobody selected for floppy ears. Floppy ears turned up on their own, attached to tameness. That bundle of traits got a name, the domestication syndrome, and something like it shows up across a strange range of domesticated animals. One proposed explanation points at neural crest cells. These are a group of cells in the early embryo that migrate outwards and become, among other things, the glands that drive the fear response. They also become pigment cells and cartilage in the ears and the snout and part of the jaw. So turn down the fear pathway, the argument goes, and you may be turning down that entire delivery. That is a hypothesis, not an established fact, and it has serious critics. And the fox experiment itself has taken damage. In 2020, Catherine Lord, Gregor Larson, Ray Coppinger, and Eleanor Carlson pointed out that Belyaev's foxes came from a Canadian fur farm. They had already been bred in captivity for decades before the experiment started, and captive fur foxes were already less fearful than wild ones. So the starting line was not where the story says it was, and some of those traits may have been in the population before anybody selected for anything. The foxes still show you something real. Select on temperament alone, and you drag other things along with it. They're just not a clean replay of what happened to the wolf. Now the other half of it, what the animal turned into. Because a dog is not simply a tame wolf. A dog is a wolf that acquired a new sense. Come back to the pointing. Brian Hare and Michael Tomasello ran that test properly. Two containers, food hidden under one, and a human points at the right one. Dogs get it immediately. Chimpanzees do badly. Wolves raised in human homes do badly. And puppies manage it at 9 weeks old, including puppies raised with very little human contact. So it is not something a dog works out over a lifetime. It arrives already installed. That result has been argued over, and some studies find that intensively socialized wolves can learn it. But the developmental gap is real. Dogs turn up already looking at our faces. And there's a hormonal loop running underneath it. In 2015, Fumi Kikusui's group in Japan measured oxytocin in dogs and in their owners while the two of them simply sat together. When the dog looked into the owner's eyes, the owner's oxytocin went up. The owner then touched and talked to the dog more. And then the dog's oxytocin went up. It is the same feedback loop that runs between a human parent and a human baby. Hand-raised wolves do not do this. They mostly avoid the eye contact that starts it. So the dog did not just learn to live beside us. It got into a channel that was already there and was never meant for it. What people got in exchange was not small. A dog detects things at a distance you cannot. It hears what you cannot. It can hold a large animal at bay, follow a wounded one for kilometers, and stand guard all night for the price of scraps. On Zhokhov Island, in the Siberian Arctic, there are dog remains from about 9,000 years ago, together with sled runners and pieces of harness. Not just dogs. A working sled team, with signs of the people that were already choosing animals by size and by job. 9,000 years ago, in the high Arctic, somebody was breeding a specialist. Which brings us to the last thing, and it is the part one did not expect. Go back to that list of traits. Shorter face, smaller teeth, lighter brow, reduced difference between males and females, playfulness carried on into adulthood, lower reactive aggression. That is the domestication syndrome, and it is the checklist we use to tell a domesticated animal from a wild one. Now, run the checklist on us. Compare a modern human skull with a human skull from 300,000 years ago, and you find a shorter face, smaller teeth, a much lighter brow ridge, and less difference between the sexes. Robert Sierri and colleagues traced exactly that change and connected it to the point where the archaeological record fills up with trade, ornament, and cooperation. Richard Wrangham has argued the same thing at book length, that we selected ourselves over thousands of generations against the most reactively aggressive members of every group. Not against violence in general. Humans plan a great deal of violence against the individual who cannot stop himself. It is contested, and the domestication syndrome as a single tidy package has taken real criticism, including from the people who took apart the Fox study. But the shape of the argument is hard to walk away from. We have spent this whole episode asking when we domesticated the dog. The uncomfortable possibility is that there were already 2 domesticated animals sitting at that fire. And it explains the pointing better than anything else does. A dog can read your face because at some point our faces became readable, and because both species had already stopped being the kind of animal that has to fight everything it meets. Which is the real answer to where the dog came from. Not a clever hunter who caught a wolf cub. 2 species, both of which had already been quietly selecting themselves for the ability to sit near something and not attack it. And one grave near Bonn, 14,000 years old, with a sick puppy in it that nobody could save and that somebody could not bring themselves to leave behind.